Hey everyone, welcome to Kitty Tiny Woodcraft. My name's Jim. Today I'm making what I'm going to call Beauty and the Beast rose. Essentially, it's just a rose I took from my wife's 1-year anniversary bouquet and dried it and then cast it in deep pour epoxy. I did have a couple issues with this throughout the pour. However, you'll find out what those are later in the video. So let's go ahead and start working. With this project, the first thing you might notice is that we're not in my backyard, we're actually in my basement, which is kind of a catch-all for everything else in the house, as I'm sure a lot of you have the same situation. We're working in the basement because this project's going to take a couple days to dry and cure. That way I don't have to move it back and forth or touch it really once it's set up and ready. The first thing we're going to do is I'm going to mix the tabletop epoxy, which is a 1-to-1 ratio, and that will go over the purple base of the flower. This is one of the flowers that we saved that we're going to cast in the epoxy. The first thing we're going to do today is just put the tabletop epoxy on the wooden part. This flower actually isn't glued into this base yet because the drill I used was tight enough, it just slipped in there and it's pretty tight in there. You may be wondering what this writing is on the bottom. This was actually originally a test piece of Purple Heart that I used to try out the system we used for our wedding guest book, which I'll show you a picture of in a second. And I decided instead of just throwing this wood away, I was going to save it, and no one's really going to see the bottom of it, so I didn't want to take the time to sand all of that back off. As I said before, we're going to put the tabletop epoxy on this, and then we'll set up the mold beside it for the ultimate pour that we're going to be doing in about a day. And this is wax paper so that I can put it on, leave it, and then I don't have to worry about it sticking later. I've now mixed the epoxy for 5 minutes, which is in accordance with the directions. I'm now going to take my foam paintbrush and paint it onto the wood. That way it won't cause any bubbles to come out of the wood from the epoxy soaking in. I should have put the glove on from the start, so I put it on now, and this will help protect my fingers from the resin that's being left on here as I'm coating the sides and bottom, or sides and top. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to work on the actual mold for when we do the deep pour. From that clip you watched, you can see that I now have the Tyvek tape all put up together. I pre-drilled the holes and put screws in and pulled the screws out to make sure everything fits. I'm now going to put the caulk in all the edges of everything to make sure we have a watertight seal. I'm also going to then re-tape all the edges on the outside also just to make sure there's no spillage. And then once that's done, I have to wait a day for the caulk and the epoxy on the rose to dry. And then we can go ahead and do the deep pour. But luckily for you guys, that'll only be a few seconds. It's now been 2 days since I applied the epoxy to the stem of the rose and the base. I've now got it set up to where it's going to be able to be poured into. One thing I didn't show you guys was that I actually placed extra Tyvek tape on these 3 sides, this side, the bottom, and then this other side, just to cover up all these extra seams. That way, hopefully, there won't be any chance of spillage at all. I've seen way too many horror stories where people have let this epoxy go and they've had a leak and it's just gone out completely. To keep the rose upright in this mold the way I want it, I'm using a clamp. I also have some saran wrap on here just to make sure that after I put the epoxy in, I can cover it, and that way everything we're doing is to keep the dust out. The epoxy I'm using is the same company, it's just their deep cast version. This is a 2-to-1 ratio. So we're going to go ahead and mix it up. I'm going to let this sit for a few minutes, let the bubbles pop up. Then once the bubbles are all up, I'm going to hit it with the butane torch to get those bubbles out. And then once it's in the mold, I'm going to hit it with the butane torch again just to make sure we get all the little bubbles. I'm only going to fill it up to about the rose this first time because I know that's perfectly halfway. I'm estimating this first pour is going to take about 9 ounces. So let's go ahead and get mixing. I've now mixed the epoxy for 5 minutes. I'm now going to wait a few more minutes just to let as many of these bubbles as you see forming come to the surface. Then I'm going to hit it with the blowtorch, and then after I do that, then I will dump it in and let it set and then see how many bubbles remain. And if need be, I will then hit it with the blowtorch again after it's poured into the mold. As you can tell by me holding this up, there is still a bunch of little bubbles internally in the epoxy. I'm going to hope that since this is the first time I'm using this epoxy that it will, all those bubbles eventually will raise to the top and pop themselves. If not, we're not going to get the look I'm going for because obviously you want it crystal clear. You almost want it to look like a Beauty and the Beast rose. If this ends up not working out very well, I may have to switch epoxies for later projects. But we're going to go ahead and do this pour now and get the epoxy into the mold. And what I'm trying to do is to keep what my original intent was. I was hoping to not splash a lot of this on. However, it looks like I'm not going to be able to get it, so I'm just going to end up pouring and hoping for the best. Well, as you can see, I guesstimated the epoxy at 9 ounces for this first pour, 18 overall. And as you can see, my guesstimation was spot on. 9 ounces put me right at the stem of the rose. So now what we're gonna do is I'm gonna give it another 5-10 minutes and then go ahead and just run the blowtorch in here real fast, trying to avoid burning the rose any, which I hope that doesn't happen. Then I'll cover it with the saran wrap and let it sit for the 48 hours until it's right at a gel consistency, and then I'll do the second pour, just because I want to try to avoid having to sand it any or do anything like that. Since a lot of the rose petals are still up above the epoxy, it'll be really hard to try to get in there. So we'll just come back 48 hours before it cures completely, do our second pour, and go from there. It's now been 48 hours since that initial pour. You may have noticed that there's no clamp here anymore. That was just to make sure the wood base would stay where it is until the epoxy was hard enough that it could keep the wood there itself. Also, taking off the cling wrap, I realized there's a couple things I should have done before this first pour. The main thing was I should have sanded the base with 320 grit to help with adhesion. Hopefully that doesn't mess up the adhesion too much. The other thing was, you can't see it from this video, but unfortunately there is quite a few tiny little bubbles throughout this pour. Once I get it unmolded, I'll show you in closer detail some of those air bubbles. For this round, I think I'm going to try to, after I pour the epoxy, and I'm going to try to jiggle it or something else to get more of those air bubbles to the top. For some reason, this just set fast and the bubbles stayed inside of it. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start with the second pour. Then I will give it 3 days, and then we'll be able to fully unmold this, and I'll be able to show you guys close-ups. This time around, since I do have the clamp off, I'm going to go ahead and pour it onto the base. That way it has a lot less space that it has to drop down to, and hopefully that will help prevent bubbles also. So here we go. I'm definitely going to try to be jiggling this or shaking it a little bit, just because as you saw from that pour, and as you just see right there, there is still quite a bit of air popping out of this rose from the epoxy that's going in now. So I'm going to jiggle it, try to get it saturated more throughout the rose petals, and then we'll go from there. It's been 5 days now since we poured the second coat of epoxy into the mold. We're going to go ahead, remove it from the mold. Here's the rose completely unmolded. As you can see, I'm going to have to do some sanding because you can see the different tape lines that was left in there from the mold and the caulk that was left in it. However, I have to say, with the process I did with taping it everywhere and everything, you saw it pretty much peeled off right away. It just took putting a little prying force into pulling it from the block, and it came out nice and easy. So let's go on and start sanding. So it didn't actually take me that long to sand this down to get it back to this shine. It took me about 2.5 hours, I would say. And that was going the whole way from about 120 grit, and then each grit up to 400 that I have, and then skipping to 800, then 1,000 grit, then 2,000 grit, and finally 3,000 grit. And then after I was done sanding with sandpaper, I then took a plastic polishing compound that I bought and just finished it up. I probably could have spent a little bit longer to sand it because you can't necessarily see it from this video, but there is a little bit whiter around the edges. I actually ended up kind of liking that look because it almost gives emphasis to the rose and hides the excess epoxy that's there. Plus, the wife absolutely loves it the way it is. There is a few things that I wish could have gone a little bit better. As you can see, there's just hundreds of thousands of little bubbles all over the back side of this rose, which was on the underside of the first pour. And I'm not sure how, other than maybe a pressure pot, but with how often I'm doing deep pour epoxy, a pressure pot would not be worth it at this point. The other issue I had with this is I waited 24 hours to do the second pour, which apparently must have been too long for the temperature it was at. You can clearly see the line that was left from the first pour to the second pour. Actually, the interesting thing for this side is that line you see right there isn't actually caused by the pour. It's just naturally occurring that there's a color separation like that. So I'll have to figure out how to try to get the bubbles out the next time I do a deep cast. But other than that, this turned out great. Looks beautiful. Hopefully it'll last forever now, and I won't start losing petal by petal like the actual Beauty and the Beast rose. Thank you for watching this video. Go ahead and comment if you like this video or if you have any questions. Also, please go ahead and hammer that like button. Thank you for watching and have a good one.